Hey y'all, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about The Premonition on Blu-ray. The Premonition came out in 1975 and was directed by Robert Allen Schnitzer, and this particular release comes courtesy of Arrow Video. And Arrow Video has kind of become the equivalent to a Criterion Collection and when it comes to releasing or re-releasing genre films onto Blu-ray. And they almost always provide an immersive experience for their audiences because, with the films that you're watching, they look and feel like, whatever decade that they were made in. But on the other hand, with the supplemental material, you get a lot of modern insight into something that was made from back then. And so you kind of get the best of both worlds with an Arrow Video release. So The Premonition is a movie that certainly benefits from coming, from Arrow Video. And another thing about The Premonition is the fact that it came out 1 year before Brian De Palma's Carrie. And so Carrie, which of course is based on Stephen King novel of the same name, is a film that gets a lot of credit for kind of kickstarting the whole parapsychology, horror genre. But The Premonition did it first. And I'm not necessarily saying they did it better, but they did do it first, though, considering that it came out literally 1 year before Carrie. And while the parapsychology is conveyed in different ways in both movies, there is also the fact that family is seen as a source of horror or danger in both movies, albeit in different ways. And so The Premonition does have some commonality with Carrie, but they're both very different films. And I think that while Carrie was certainly, awesome and had a unforgettably, bombastic climax, and I mean that in a good way, The Premonition has a more slow burn approach and kind of, puts us, on the same level as, the characters that are on screen here. In this respect, we have two sets of characters that are very human and very flawed individuals, which definitely helps to ground things in reality, even when the parapsychology aspect kind of comes into play. But there is a more, I guess you could say, everyday mundane reality angle that The Premonition has that Carrie doesn't. Like, Carrie has more of a surreal touch to it, whereas The Premonition, it certainly has surreal moments, but it is more of a more grounded movie, at least in my opinion. But another thing about the movie is that it has what, in my opinion, is one of actor Richard Lynch's best performances on film. And so Richard Lynch, for those of you who don't know, was an actor who was exceptionally skilled at playing villains. And a big part of that was because he had a very sinister visage, because he had more or less set himself on fire when he was younger, because he was messing around with some hard drugs, and, well, as one tends to do when they're on hard drugs, they set themselves on fire. But anyway, he survived the experience, thankfully, but it scarred his skin up pretty good, and as a result, he looked pretty sinister, which is definitely something he used to his advantage whenever he played a bad guy. And so, the movies that I'm familiar, with him, for are, The Sword and the Sorcerer, Invasion USA, Cut and Run, Bad Dreams, things like that. And so while the movies that he was in may not have been good, he was good in them and oftentimes helped to elevate them. Now, I'm not saying Invasion USA is a good movie by any means, but he was awesome in that movie. And as for, say, like The Sword and the Sorcerer, in my opinion, that was, not a masterpiece, but it was a cool fantasy film. But his performance definitely elevated it, because it had this sort of a sort of a Game of Thrones level scheming and backstabbing, for his character, that, of course, it came out before Game of Thrones, and so you watch Game of Thrones, and then you see Sword and the Sorcerer, and you're like, did George R.R. Martin get some ideas from this guy, or from this character at least? So, but anyway, though, with the Premonition, on the other hand, Richard Lynch, while he's definitely once again a memorable villain, there is a sense of nuanced humanity that is on hand for his character here that you probably don't see in a lot of his other films. And so that's why I would say that The Premonition is probably his best film as an actor, because you see him as like a flawed human being who is nonetheless a source of danger. So, but anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. So The Premonition, it kicks off with this family, the Bennett family, which consists of mother Sheri, father Miles, and their daughter Janie. But Janie's actually their foster daughter. The two of them had tried to have kids prior to taking in Janie, but in both instances the child was stillborn, so they decided to try adopting. And so Janie, it turns out, is someone that they've come to love very much, and vice versa, and they see her as family, and and she sees them as her real parents. But it turns out, that her birth mother has been trying to find her for a few years now, and eventually she's able to track her daughter down, because there's this carnival that goes from town to town, and her boyfriend is a guy named Jude, who works as a carnival clown at this particular carnival. And the two of them actually met at a mental institution, and ended up becoming an item there. And Jude kind of is head over heels in love with Andrea, and agrees to help her try and find Janie, and basically he's able to take he uses his job as a clown to take photographs of families and children that come through the carnival. And there's this one particular girl that he's seen on more than one occasion that looks like the girl that Andrea has photos of. And so he shows her the photographs, and they're like, that's the same girl, that's your daughter. And so they, after confirming that Janie is indeed Andrea's daughter, Andrea and Jude concoct this scheme to kidnap her from the Bennetts. And so the mother, Sheri, sorry, I have to look at the notes here to get the names, but Sheri, though, she's on edge because she's already seen Andrea at her daughter's school when she went to pick her up. And Andrea was behind this fence talking to her daughter. And when she tells Janie to get into the car, she's like, who was that woman? What is she saying to you? And, Janie, being a little kid, she doesn't really think anything of it. She said, oh yeah, she's just a strange lady that wanted to talk to me. And so, so there's already that, her being a mother at this point. She's kind of, on the defensive, against this, strange woman. And she tries to tell her, husband, Miles, about it. But Miles, he's kind of locked into his field of as being an astrophysicist. And so all his time, his energy is being spent on his work. And so when his wife's telling him that some strange woman was trying to talk to their daughter, he doesn't really think a whole lot of it. And it also turns out that Miles has made friends with a fellow professor at the university that he's working at, a woman named Dr. Jeena Kingsley. And so while Miles is working as an astrophysicist at the university, she's working in the field of parapsychology, and so while there is a bit of a divide between them in the sense that Miles doesn't believe in anything supernatural, there is this undercurrent of attraction between the two of them, and so like the two of them, like they'll find reasons to get together and talk on their breaks or something like that, or he'll step out to quote unquote have dinner with a colleague. And so while he doesn't full on step out on his wife, he is kind of playing around behind his wife's back, in the sense that he's not telling Sheri that, hey, I'm having lunch with a colleague that happens to be a very beautiful woman. He just says, hey, I'm having lunch or dinner with a colleague. And so of course when Sheri later finds out that this colleague is actually a very beautiful woman, and Miles neglected to mention that, it's kind of like, yeah, Miles, you might have kind of dug a hole for yourself there. So while Sheri and Miles, are certainly well off and more, I guess, financially and mentally stable than Jude and Andrea, they're not without their problems though. But one night, Jude and Andrea, they put their plan to kidnap Janie into action. And on this particular night, Miles just happens to be out having dinner with a colleague, aka going to the local carnival with Jeena. And in the meantime, Sheri's at home taking care of their daughter Janie, which is when Jude and Andrea park outside their house, and Andrea sneaks into the place and finds Janie in her bedroom, and sort of picks her up and starts kind of rocking her, sort of overcome with this feeling of love and loss, and Janie's just asleep the whole time. And Sheri wakes up and she's hearing a rocking chair from Janie's bedroom, and she's like, what the heck? And so she goes into the room, and in a very disturbing moment, sees this dark-haired woman holding her daughter, and just sort of glaring at her. And the two of them are sort of facing off, and Andrea gets up and gently puts Janie back in the bed, and then charges at Sheri, and the two of them fight. But then Andrea sort of pushes Sheri off of her and onto the bed with Janie, and she looks around in a frenzy and finds a doll that belongs to Janie and steals the doll. But before she leaves, she screams out that you'll never be her real mother. I'm her real mother, and she'll always be mine. And then she runs out of the house and into the truck where Jude's waiting. But once Jude starts the truck and looks over and sees that Andrea's stolen, well, a doll and not a little girl, he's like, what did you just do? What the hell are you doing? Because the two of them made a plan to kidnap Janie, and of course Jude, because he's genuinely in love with Andrea, he's all in on the scheme and is wanting to try and be a father in this sort of makeshift family. But Andrea, she was already in a very shaky mental state, and I guess her being in a position where she would either have to hurt this other mother in front of Janie. It must have shaken her, and she couldn't bring herself to do it, or she couldn't bring herself to overpower Sheri and just ended up stealing the next best thing. It's like a doll is a symbol of innocence, a childhood innocence. And so she's kind of convinced herself that this doll is Janie, since she couldn't bring herself to actually, take Janie away from this family. And so naturally, Sheri calls the police. And when Miles, makes his way home and he sees all the police there and he finds out what happened, I mean, he's pretty shaken up at the fact that, he wasn't there to help protect his family. Now, thankfully, neither Sheri nor Janie were hurt, but the fact that someone broke into the house and tried to kidnap Janie is something that really, gets to him. And of course, Sheri, she's traumatized as hell, because, it's the exact same woman that was trying to talk to Janie at the school. And in the meantime, there's someone from the police force comes to investigate, a guy named Lieutenant Mark Denver, who comes to check things out and try and figure out, okay, well, who are these people and why did they try to kidnap you, blah, 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 or why did they try to kidnap Janie? And so when they let slip that Janie isn't their natural daughter, but their foster one, Lieutenant Denver decides to try and, look into her actual parents, and namely her birth mother, because when they mentioned that Andrea had already shown up at the school and trying to talk to Janie, Lieutenant Denver, comes to the conclusion that this very well may have been, a scheme of theirs to try and, take Janie back. And so as the movie goes on, Lieutenant Denver, he, talks to some people, and, you learn a little bit more about Andrea, and just a little bit more about Jude, but you learn about, the troubles that Andrea had and how she was actually at one point in time, a sort of renowned pianist, but because of her mental instability, she was never able to make a steady career of it. And so when she had Janie, with her, with Janie's birth father, she wasn't in a position to where she was able to care for Janie. And so she basically ran out on her daughter and her husband, who was already in a difficult position because he had been paralyzed from the waist down due to a work-related accident. And so there was already some, stress from that. And so she didn't, she wasn't able to handle, caring for her husband as well as, caring for Janie. And so she basically just kind of ran out on, her husband and her daughter. But with all the stuff that was going on in her head already, it was only a matter of time before she had a mental breakdown and ended up in a mental institution, which is where she met Jude, who in turn fell head over heels in love with her and was willing to do anything for her. But when it comes to Andrea and Jude, however, things aren't going so well for them because, the whole point was to try and kidnap Janie, but when Andrea just swiped a doll instead, here they are out in this, rundown house in the middle of nowhere by this lake, trying to hide from the authorities. Jude, went out of his way to try and secure for them safe lodgings, like a place where no one would be inclined to check out for a while until the heat dies down, and, he was even, ready to try and be a father to Janie. But when Andrea doesn't even bring the kid and just brings a doll, he just kind of goes off his rocker. And, so you have two people who basically end up butting heads, and neither of them are mentally stable. And so the outcome is not good. But in the meantime, though, while Sheri is, trying to, be more protective of Janie, and Miles is, trying to, you know, I guess be a better be a better presence in their lives, considering he's been, stepping out on his wife a lot. Um, Sheri starts being a hit with this psychic phenomena. Like she starts seeing these um, terrifying visions of Andrea and Jude kind of screaming at her. And in a couple of instances, um, they, like, the windows on her, car freeze over just out of the blue, or she's in the bathroom and the mirror freezes over just out of nowhere. And whenever she tries to tell Miles about all this, he's, because he doesn't see anything, he's initially dismissive. But then when, he, sort of comes to realize that all this stuff started going on when Andrea came onto the picture, he tries to persuade Sheri to talk to Dr. Jeena Kingsley, because of her expertise in the realm of parapsychology. Because there's clearly some sort of psychic connection between Andrea and Janie and Sheri, and it's a connection that can't really be explained, but as the movie goes on, though, this connection is something that needs to be utilized when Janie ends up in danger. And so the Premonition, yeah, it was a movie that I didn't really know a whole lot of what to expect going in, because I hadn't seen the movie when I got it, obviously. But the stuff I'd heard about it, as far as it being like a slow burn 70s horror film, it kind of grabbed my interest, because films of the 70s, whether they're sci-fi or horror, there was a sense of grounded reality that was present in those movies. And I mean, you look at a movie like Soylent Green, for example. I mean, yeah, it's more sci-fi than horror, but there is an element of horror, especially at the end of the movie, that kind of thing. But there is a sense of humanity there as well. And the Premonition, I mean, I thought, did a good job of, having like a grounded sense of reality and some very, believable portrayals of human characters. But they happen to be in a story that gradually turns into a horror movie, albeit one that is still, grounded in reality. And I thought that they did a rather interesting thing with having both families, being, flawed sets of characters, and yet having, say, their, if not redeemable points, then at least their tragic points. Like in the case of Jude and Andrea, I mean, both characters are clearly mentally unwell, beyond a certain point, but at the same time, Andrea, who, is determined to reclaim her daughter, because, I mean, she realizes that she was a bad mother and wants to try and make things right, but because of her mental instability, she's not in a position to where, she can just come in and say, "Hi, I'm Andrea's mother, could I spend time with my daughter?" That kind of thing. And the actress who played Andrea was a woman named Ellen Barber, and I don't think I've seen her in anything else, but Ellen Barber was really good in this movie. In fact, I mean, I almost wanted to say she felt like the lead at a certain point in the film. But then things happen with her character to where, the character of Sheri, the foster mother, ends up getting the lion's share of the lead time. But Ellen Barber, though, I thought did a really good job of, making Andrea a sympathetic character, but also at the same time showing that there are reasons why she was put in a mental asylum. Okay, like she really does have her character really does have mental problems, but at the same time, that we do feel sorry for her, and we do sympathize with her in a sense that she genuinely loves her daughter and wants to try and be a good mother again, but it's just too much damage has been done already. But as far as the character of Jude, this is where Richard Lynch really shines as an actor, because we see him as someone who is a part of this mentally unbalanced duo, and in some ways he kind of comes across as the more stable of the two, which it kind of makes you wonder, like, how bad of a situation is this if Richard Lynch is the more stable of the villains, but when push comes to shove, though, there comes a point where he breaks, and it's a terrifying thing to see, because for the most part he's been seen as someone who, while he may have had a shady past, he seems to be someone who's trying to turn his life around and make a genuine go at being a carnival clown, because it's something that he clearly enjoys doing. But the fact that he's head over heels in love with Andrea and is willing to do anything for her, including kidnapping a child, I mean, that's where his downfall is going to come, because as you watch the movie, it becomes clear that while Andrea may care for Jude, she's not in love with him, whereas Jude is in love with her. And so when the harsh reality of their scheme kind of hits them, there's a very intense bit where they have this sort of mutual breakdown, and you see, they're at the house on the lake, this rundown house on the lake, and Jude, he's just kind of going stir crazy and fuming at the fact that Andrea's just holding this little doll and talking to it like it's the girl that they were supposed to kidnap in the first place, and the girl that he was going to try and turn his life upside down in order to try and raise with Andrea, but he's seeing all this, and then he just snaps, and that in turn leads to Andrea going off the rails even more than she already was, and lashing out at Jude and insulting him in a way that if you're a man, you feel it, basically saying that how would he know how to be a father when he's not even a man, or he's not a real man, or something along those lines. And basically, how there are insults for men and insults for women, that you like, women hear these insults for them and men hear these insults for them, and it strikes home and it hurts. Okay, so when Andrea says that to Jude, it breaks him, and as a result, there's a very tragic outcome. And I gotta say, like, when I saw, Richard Lynch in this part, I mean, yes, he was doing a good job of playing a villain, which is, kind of, not unexpected, because he's a good villain actor, right? But I felt sorry for his character, because, he's someone that I get the feeling that if, he and Andrea hadn't crossed paths, I mean, he would have been content with, working as a, circus clown. But because he and Andrea crossed paths and he fell in love with her, I mean, he, became convinced that, if he did this or that or whatnot for her, then she would be in love with him, when she was never in love with him in the first place. And so it was like, you get the idea that the relationship they had may have been one of convenience as opposed to, say, actual love and affection, so it's like they met at the mental institution, and they got out together, and they both knew each other at that point, and so they wanted to stick with what was familiar, but when Jude basically finds out that Andrea didn't even love him in the first place and doesn't even consider him a man or a real man, mind you, Andrea is crazy, right? But considering that Andrea is someone that Jude is, head over heels in love with, I mean, it's not surprising that he breaks when he does. But when he does break, I mean, it's a terrifying and sad thing to behold, simply because, in both characters, there is that sense of humanity there, and they both come across as real people, but very flawed ones. Like in the case of Andrea, her mental instability, and in the case of Jude, his, his love for Andrea, which turned out to not be, I guess you could say, a healthy love, if he snaps like that. But on the other hand, considering that he was doing everything for her, and then she ends up more or less spitting in his face, I mean, yeah, it's a very tragic outcome. And both Richard Lynch and Ellen Barber do a good job of selling the tragedy of their characters, as well as the horror of their characters. Because you have Andrea, who's who looks like, in certain shots, like especially at night, she kind of looks like something you'd see from The Grudge or something like that, with her long black hair. And with Richard Lynch, I mean, and for me personally, I mean, having seen him in villainous roles already, I was taken aback at just how intense he was in this part. Because we see a character who seems calm and for the most part well collected, but then when we see him break down, I mean, this isn't mustache twirling evil Richard Lynch. This is Richard Lynch playing a character who is at the end of his rope, and no one's there to help him. And it's a very memorable performance, I thought. As far as the Bennetts, though, the Foster family, Shannon Farrell played Sheri, Janie's foster mom, and I thought that she was she played the most sympathetic character in the film. I mean, okay, the most sympathetic character is certainly Janie, as played by Danielle Brisebois, but I think because Janie is such a small child and everything, and watching this movie as an adult, I found myself sympathizing more with the adult characters, because as an adult, I felt like I could relate to a lot of the horror that was on hand for the film, because if you have a loved one that's in danger, I mean, that's something that really gets to you. And so seeing Sheri go through her ordeal and trying to protect Janie, and she's at the mercy of this supernatural menace that seems to be coming from Andrea. I mean, she's in a situation she's never been in before, so it's bad enough that she's got someone trying to kidnap her daughter, but when there seems to be some sort of hex involved, I mean, that's something that she's helpless against. And so I thought that Shannon Farrell did a good. Shannon Farrell, I thought she did a good job of selling that part. Sharon Farrell, I was saying it wrong. I thought she did a good job of selling that part, and as a result, I mean, when she has to basically accept that the parapsychology is the only way that she's going to be able to come out of the situation alive. I mean, it's something where she has to accept it, even if she doesn't believe in it. And so for the character of Miles, actor Edward Michael Bell played Miles Bennett, and he kind of looked like a young David Cronenberg. But I mean, I thought he was pretty good in the part too that he had. And so while he was kind of playing around on his wife, I couldn't find myself, I couldn't bring myself to hate the guy or anything like that, because, I mean, he comes across as someone who, is really focused on his work and everything, and, just by happenstance, struck up a friendship with a colleague who happened to be a very beautiful woman. And so, I mean, as a human being, yeah, there's an attraction there. And so, I mean, I couldn't hate him for that or anything like that, but I also saw him as someone who, because of his commitment to his work, he sort of took his family for granted. Like, he loves Sheri and he loves Janie, but he sort of took him for granted, to a point where he saw nothing wrong with, sort of skipping out on his wife with a colleague, But, well, of course, when, he finds out, just how bad the danger is and everything, I mean, the poor guy's mortified. And so that's where I felt like, Edward Michael Bell did a good job of, selling the flawed humanity of his character. So while my sympathies were with Sheri, I did appreciate the fact that, they didn't make, the husband out to be a complete douchebag. Like, he's not a bad guy, just, he did something stupid that, kind of resulted in him being absent when, his wife needed and kid needed him, that kind of thing. And the late Jeff Corey, wonderful character actor, he's the one who played Lieutenant Mark Denver, and he was in the John Frankenheimer movie Seconds with Rock Hudson, and I remember he was also in an episode of Babylon 5. He played the sort of ambassador of the shadows, and that was the first time I saw him in anything. So anytime I see Jeff Corey in something, I'm like, hey, it's a dude from the shadow dude from Babylon 5, and but he's always been a good actor, and sometimes he can have a sort of sinister feel to his performances, but when he's playing good guys, though, there's no sinister feel. Like, here he plays a member of the police force who is a good guy and who's trying to help his family out, and we see him following every lead he can, and at no point does he come across as someone who doesn't care about his job or for the people he's trying to help. Like he really does take his responsibility seriously. And so Jeff Corey, I thought, did a good job playing this figure of authority, who even when things take on a more bizarre slant with this parapsychology coming into play, he takes it seriously in the sense that he realizes that there's something more at work here beyond his experience, and so I appreciated seeing that with his character. Excuse me. But yeah, also Chitra, Neogy, I hope I'm saying her name right. She's the actress who played Dr. Jeena Kingsley, and I liked her character too. And a very beautiful woman, back in the day, in the 70s here. But I thought that she did a good job playing her part as the professor of the parapsychology department at the university, and the lines of dialogue that she has about parapsychology were very interesting, and in some ways I found myself kind of learning more about parapsychology from what her character had to say. Now, granted, I understand other people were writing the lines, but she's the person on screen, selling the dialogue, and I thought she did a pretty good job of that. And so it's like she really came across as someone who had been making it, her career to study this hitherto unknown field, or a lesser known field, and trying to, get her fellow academics to take it seriously. And also I liked her chemistry with Edward Michael Bell. So basically whenever her character and Miles were on screen together, even though Miles was technically kind of cheating on his wife when he was with her, they really kind of came across as likable, and their mutual attraction came across as genuine. So and of course when she, kind of realizes that, you know, Miles has a, wife and daughter, and they're in danger. She goes out of her way to, try and help them however she can when it comes to, say, telling them what she knows about parapsychology and trying to, get them to, you know, work on to carry out this plan that, utilizes parapsychology but will hopefully stop this nightmare from happening. So all in all, I thought that, the characters were very well written and they were very well acted. And when it came to, say, the horror of the, situation, I thought that even if there hadn't been any sort of supernatural angle in this movie, I thought that it would have worked as a sort of grounded in reality type of horror, in the sense that you have, one family that's trying to, protect their daughter, and that sees their adopted daughter as their own, and then you see, this other family that's unstable trying to kidnap this family. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there's a very real sense of horror there, and I thought that, they did very well in conveying that type of horror. But when it came to the supernatural stuff, it was fascinating to see because, I mean, you have these memorable moments where, Sheri, like when she's by herself at one point and the mirror frosts over. It's a rather unnerving moment because, I mean, she's freaking out and she's screaming for her husband, but when he comes in, there's nothing there, And so, when the horror is kind of like that, I mean, we feel sorry for Sheri. And we understand, Miles' skepticism to a certain point, but we're also, in Sheri's, shoes the whole way through. So whenever something of a supernatural angle happens, whether it's, the ice frosting over on something or, her seeing, these terrifying, images of Andrea, screaming at her or Jude screaming at her, something like that. I mean, it's something that stands out, because the rest of the movie had been pretty ordinary up to that point, and so when the supernatural comes in, even though it's done in a more subtle way as opposed to, say, something like Carrie, it does manage to stand out because up until those moments, the movie was pretty run-of-the-mill in terms of, kind of feeling like this, dark family drama or something like that, but there's also, there were also some moments that I thought were very intriguing in a sense that we don't know why they're happening, but they are. Like there's a moment where Sheri had done a painting of Janie, and there comes a point where, she's, looking at it, and this is after, Janie's been kidnapped, right? Or she's, been abducted for real this time. And so they don't know where she is, but she's looking at the picture and, she starts to see this red paint come out of one of Janie's eyes on the painting, right? And it looks like blood. And it's a pretty spooky visual. And then, of course, we get to a point where when they learn more about Andrea and when Lieutenant Denver, tells them that Andrea was once, a renowned pianist, and they're able to sort of, use some of her music to sort of try and get in touch with her. And you see Sheri sort of becoming Andrea almost. Like, she still looks like herself, but when she's at a piano, she suddenly becomes like a woman possessed. And, moments like that I thought were very fascinating to watch, just from like a supernatural perspective, but also from a character perspective. Because you see Sheri, or you see, Shannon Farrell basically trying to playing Sheri as a woman who's trying to hold on to whatever fragile sanity she has, because the whole supernatural, bit is really, getting to her. But like when she's at the piano, trying to make a connection with Andrea, and also trying to, in some way, get her daughter, to come back to her. We see her basically trying to fight to try and stay herself, but at the same time, Andrea is kind of taking over when it comes to the piano, because like she's really throwing herself into it, and you get the idea that that's not something that Sheri would have done. It's something more Andrea. But then you see Sheri sort of trying to, stay in control, and I thought it was a pretty neat performance. So I will say that in some respects, for the supernatural angle, I do appreciate that they didn't come right out and offer a straight up explanation. Like there was more, a few guesses and a couple of theories as to what was going on that were offered in the film. Like at one point, Sheri, is, whispering to her husband that Andrea's put a hex on them. But when you consider the fact that a lot of these supernatural occurrences were happening after Andrea's character had met with somewhat of a tragic fate, you're kind of like, okay, is that what's going on? Or is it just the overall trauma of the situation, and basically somehow manifesting itself on a physical level, against, the woman that, Andrea, holds in ill regard for, quote unquote, taking her daughter, So I do appreciate that in some respects, like they didn't give a straight up answer as to why all this was going on, but I do wish that they had clarified it in some way, like maybe not a 100% clear cut explanation, but, something that was treated as less of, a wild guess for a bizarre situation, like something that was like, okay, yes, this is a very strange situation, but considering the evidence, here's what's going on. That kind of thing I feel like would, gone a long way towards, giving us an answer, as well as, the characters an answer too. So I'm kind of 50-50 on how the supernatural stuff was angled. So what we see on screen, it's, brief but memorable, because the lion's share of the movie is focused on this, twisted family drama, but on the other hand, when it comes to the supernatural stuff, as memorable as it is, when it shows up on screen, I just would have liked a more clear-cut explanation as to why it was happening, that kind of thing, as opposed to, say, having to go with, the guesses that other characters were having. So I've always been 50-50 on that, like I can appreciate not knowing exactly what's going on if I'm looking at things from the perspective of a character who's just kind of dropped into the fire with no warning. But on the other hand, though, when it comes to, horror, a little bit of an explanation, can go a long way. And so while there kind of was an explanation, and you can kind of put two and two together, I just kind of, wish that certain characters had come out and said, okay, considering all the evidence here, because, we're not idiots, like we're professionals, we're actually putting together evidence. Considering all the evidence we got, as crazy as the situation is, this is probably what's happening, and here's what we need to do. And so I think it would have benefited more from that approach, as opposed to wild mass guessing and then sort of put two and two together and, okay, Hail Mary play, hope for the best, that kind of thing. And I do think that while the slow burn approach for the most part works, I understand that not all people are going to be fond of slow burn approaches. And so when you have a slow burn horror film that doesn't focus a whole lot on the supernatural, and is more so focused on, the tensions and the conflicts, between the two sets of parents, like it feels more like a tragic, sad drama than a horror film. And so when the horror does happen, sometimes it feels like, an intrusive element, simply because, the amount of time and effort they've made on getting us to understand, these characters. I could see where the slow burn approach could, work, against the movie in the eyes of some. So, I mean, I personally didn't have a whole lot of problem with it, but I guess it also kind of goes hand in hand with, the explanation of the horror. So, I think had the explanation been in place, like had there been a semi clear cut explanation, like I was describing, I think that the slow burn approach into things, wouldn't have been as much of a problem as some people might perceive it as, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give The Premonition 4 out of 5 stars. This was actually a good movie. And as far as special features go, you have a rather neat introduction by a guy named Stephen Thrower, who's the author of something called Nightmare USA, and he was also a former member of the musical group Coil. So, but he has a pretty good introduction where he offers his take on the film, and he also talks about the connection to Carrie and some of the stuff I mentioned at the beginning of the film. But he praises this particular movie as one of the films of the 70s that made family an important part of the horror story. So nice little introduction from him. You have an isolated score, which I haven't actually listened to, but to be fair, the actual score of the movie, I neglected to mention, the music was by a guy named Henry Mollicone. I hope I'm saying his name right, but it's a really neat score for the film, and at times it's kind of relaxing and whimsical, and other times it's eerie. And so basically the guy knew how to score for what for the appropriate scenes, and he did a pretty good job with it. So I imagine if you listen to the isolated score, you'd appreciate the music even more. But you also have a really good audio commentary with Robert Allen Schnitzer, who not only directed the movie but produced it and was one of the screenwriters for it as well. And I forgot who the guy was that he was talking to on this, but he has a lot of good observations about the movie and tells some good making of types of stories for the movie. And when the camera is looking at some of the backgrounds and some of the scenes, he it gets sort of nostalgic and reminisces about certain points, and so it's a nice little commentary track. And I liked how this is a guy who he really hasn't done a whole lot film wise. I don't think, like, he did like a couple of student films and a movie or two here and there after The Premonition, but The Premonition is probably his best known movie. But he's very proud of it, and he enjoyed talking about it, and he enjoyed talking about how they made it and everything, and he's very complimentary of all the actors in the film. So it was a nice little commentary track. And you also have, let's see, Pictures from a Premonition, and it's a making of documentary that's got interviews with Robert Allen Schnitzer, composer Henry Mollicone, and cinematographer Victor Milt. And Victor Milt is someone who I neglected to mention when I was actually talking about the review here, but his camera work is pretty well done in the film. There are times where it looks kind of surreal, like especially when he's shooting something that's in the early morning hours. Like you have that beautiful opening sequence where Jude steps outside of his carnival van or carnival trailer and before the day's starting, he's doing these exercises, and the way he's doing them and the way Richard Lynch is being shot, and then you have Henry Mollicone's score being kind of whimsical, and considering the fact that he's a circus clown, the score kind of goes hand in hand, and in hindsight, in a way, it kind of makes the character of Jude feel even more tragic, because that particular moment at the beginning, it's such a good bit from, on one hand, it's a good bit of physical acting on Richard Lynch's part, because he's supposed to be conveying something about his character through how he's exercising, and then you have the nice whimsical score by Henry Mollicone, and then you have some wonderful camera work by Victor Milt, and you get scenes like that, to where even some of the background imagery can say something about a character, and so Victor Milt was definitely instrumental in one of the reasons why the Premonition was as memorable as it was. But you also have archive interviews with Robert Allen Schnitzer and Richard Lynch, and those are both good little interviews. And Richard Lynch, it was nice to hear him talk about this movie, because you got the idea that people wanted to talk to him more about his mustache twirling villain roles, because usually he played those kind of villains, but the fact that he was able to talk about a role that was particularly fleshed out was something that he enjoyed talking about. And he went on record to say that like when you're an actor, you'll probably do a lot of movies, but only a few that you'll be proud of. But he said the Premonition was something that he was proud of, and so that was nice to hear, considering that I think that the Premonition was probably his best movie. And so you have trailers and TV spots, and then you have 3 short films by Robert Allen Schnitzer: Vernal Equinox, A Terminal Point, and A Rumbling in the Land. And so, yeah, these short films are in black and white, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot in terms of story, but I mean, they are fascinating to watch for a little bit, because of like when they were filmed, because they were black and white, and it looks like they were from the 60s. I think they were from the 60s, and so you're seeing things from a different time period and everything, and there are some intriguing bits of music, which kind of adds a sort of dreamlike feel to things. But in my opinion, the short films, they kind of run on a little too long. I think that maybe if there had been more of a focus on like a concrete story, with the first 2 short films in particular, I think that they would have been better. But at the same time, I mean, they are interesting to watch, up to a point, simply because of the, black and white visuals, as well as, the music and everything. But at the same time, if you don't watch them, you're not missing much. But and you also have reversible sleeve art, and this is what the theatrical artwork originally looked like. Sorry. So yeah, both pieces of artwork I thought were pretty good. And while this one's definitely, the creepier of the 2 pieces, I feel like this particular picture does a better job of capturing the overall feeling of the film, because here it kind of makes it look like, I mean, it's a clear-cut case of demonic possession, or it looks like the doll is about to, take on a life of its own and try and kill someone or something like that. Whereas here, you see most of the principal characters, and this sort of unsettling, feeling that seems to, be all about this picture. It's like all the characters are on edge, with the exception of Jude here, because he's in his element as a clown. But then again, you see him without his makeup right there, and he's got this intense focus. And here's Andrea right there, and I like how, the way she's drawn, I mean, it's like she's side by side with Jude, but she's thinking about anything but him. Like she's thinking about her kid and everything. And here's Sheri and her daughter right there, or holding her daughter, and here's the doll that Andrea ends up stealing, right? But yeah, so I personally, I mean, I like both pieces of artwork, but I feel like this one does a better job of capturing, the feeling of the movie. So, but yeah, that was The Premonition. I'll give it 4 out of 5 stars. It was a good movie, and if you like character-driven horror films, or slow burn character-driven horror films, then this is definitely a movie check out. That, and if you're a Richard Lynch fan. So, but anyway, thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. And if you made it this far, I appreciate it. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So, y'all take care. Have a good night. Bye.